For a long time I understood nihilism very well. I could understand its rationale, associated with the tragedy of life, associating with suffering and evil, associated with the observation of finitude and the arbitrary and unjust nature of the world. But the more I've thought about it, the less I've come to believe that there's any excuse for it whatsoever. And I think the reason for that is that it forestalls effort. It forestalls the ability to discover for yourself. Maybe there's no reason to be so goddamn hopeless, except that it's easier to be useless. Now, and I'm not, believe me, I'm not making that case. I'm not saying that that's what's besetting people who are clinically depressed, for example. That's not my point. Clinical depression is a terrible thing. There's lots of reasons to be rendered, to be tossed into a catastrophic condition. That isn't what I mean. I mean that kind of cynical, arrogant, rational, hyper-intelligent nihilism that throws the world away as if it's of little use before it's been properly engaged with. Better to engage with it and see what happens, and better to make the assumption that if the world isn't returning to you what it is that you need, then either you're not doing it right or you've conceptualized what you need badly. Why not at least open yourself up to that possibility, right? Because you could be wrong. Hopefully, if you're suffering, this is a great thing to know. Hopefully, if you're suffering, you're wrong. Because if you're suffering and you're right, then there's nowhere to go. So it's very useful to find out whatever errors you might be committing. Another thing that's really interesting about the Jews in the Old Testament, it's a remarkable thing. Every single time they get flattened by God, it's always their fault. They never say, the world that God created was corrupt and God is evil. They never say that, no matter what happens, right? No matter what catastrophe occurs, when they have every reason to at least put that hypothesis forward, they don't. They say, we erred, we walked off the path, it's our fault. And that's hard, you know, because it puts all the weight of human catastrophe on the human being. That's very hard. But the upside is, it gives you the control. It opens up the door, it opens up the possibility that you could be the person that could set it right if you would just let go of what's in your way. Whatever that is. And the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? I guess God is talking to himself here, or maybe he's talking to the angels. But I think he's trying to make a decision. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come to me. And if not, I will know. Well, we don't know what's happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, but we know that God's got wind of it and that that's not good. And we know that sin means to miss the mark. And so we know that whatever has happened in Sodom and Gomorrah means that something about the natural ethical order of things has been seriously violated. And there's a strong intimation in the Old Testament, which I think, by the way, is completely correct, that if the proper order of being is violated, and that's something like the balance between chaos and order, say, if the proper balance of being is violated, then all hell will break loose. And one of the things I can tell you from reading a very comprehensive set of myths from around the world is that that's a conclusion that human beings have come to everywhere. Stay on the goddamn path and be careful. Because if you start to mess around and you deviate, especially if you know that you're deviating, things are not going to go well for you. And that idea is everywhere. And I think it's right. I think the idea is right, because there aren't that many ways of doing things right, and there's a lot of ways of doing things wrong. And if you do things wrong, the consequences of doing them wrong can be truly catastrophic. You know, one of the things I learned from reading Viktor Frankl first, but then Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who I think did a deeper job, was that, and Václav Havel thought the same thing, that these people were very much trying to understand what happened in places like Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago is a particularly good analysis of what happened in the Soviet Union. And his conclusion, and it's a 2,100-page conclusion, and it's like hammered home with a hammer. It's a book that everyone should read, you know, assuming that you can read a 2,100-page scream, because that's basically what it is. You know, first of all, what he does is document just how terrible things were in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959. And no matter how terrible you think they were, unless you know the stories, they were a lot more terrible than that. And they were terrible personally, because everyone lied. They were terrible in families, because 2 out of 5 people were government informers. They were terrible among friends, because no one could tell each other the truth. They were terrible socially, because the whole system was corrupt and ran on slave labor. And they were terrible philosophically, because the doctrine of man upon which the state was founded was hopeless and nihilistic. And they were murderous, destructive, and genocidal. It's like they got it wrong at every single level of analysis simultaneously. And the question is, why? And Solzhenitsyn's answer, and to some degree Viktor Frankl's answer as well, and Václav Havel, and I would say also Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, they all ended up in the same conceptual sphere. And the answer was because individual people lived crooked lives. Because individual people swallowed lies and spoke them and didn't stand up for the truth. And the corruption that spread from each individual pulled the entire state mechanism into that corruption and made everything into hell. You know, there are other theories. Obedience, right? That's kind of the Milgram idea from that it's easy to make human beings obedient to people in authority. And I've explored that idea quite a bit with regards to what happened, for example, in the Nazi concentration camps. And yes, you can set circumstances up so that people are likely to be obedient to orders that are pathological. There's no doubt about that. And yes, sometimes that's indicative of the weakness of their character, but that's not the issue. And the idea that what happened in Nazi Germany was because a population of good people listened to a tiny minority of bad people, that's really not a good theory. The Nazi ethos was there at every single level of the social organization, right? Right from the familial, all the way up to the leadership. It was the same thing all the way up and all the way down. And the same thing in the Soviet Union. And so, if you miss the mark, which is apparently what the people of Sodom and Gomorrah did, their sin was grievous, then they risked destruction. And I just cannot see how, after the 20th century, anybody with any sense could possibly not see that as true.